It's my pleasure to introduce Harriet Segal for this afternoon's talk. And I'm so sorry that Prue and I are not going to be here this afternoon because we have to be out of town. But anyway, you're in for a great treat. So Harriet grew up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where she wrote short stories and poems for school publications. After graduating from Wellesley College, she had various writing jobs and worked both as a copywriter, a journalist, and freelance editor. She lived in India during the early 1960s with her scientist husband, and she wrote pamphlets for the US Information Agency and edited a newsletter, Dateline Delhi, for the American Embassy there. After her three daughters were in high school, she began to pursue a lifelong dream of writing a novel. Her first novel was Susquehanna, which was published in 1984 to critical acclaim. And it was the generational saga of an immigrant family from Eastern Europe who settled in the anthracite coal regions of northeastern Pennsylvania. That book was soon followed by Catch the Wind, the love story of two doctors with settings in Peru, Paris, and India. Next came Shadow Mountain, a novel of the American South, which was a Book of the Month Club selection, and The Skylark's Song, a Good Housekeeping novel of the month, the story of a woman whose life is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Her most recent work, The Expatriate, was published in 2011 and is available on Amazon as an ebook for Kindle. Harriet has been described as a storyteller with a strong narrative voice and a talent for painting evocative settings and creating memorable characters. She's the grandmother of 7, and she moved from New York to the Boston suburbs and spends her summers on Cape Cod. She's now working on a new novel about the world of medical research. Her connection with Bellagio is a close one. Her husband was on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, and as part of that, or rather after he retired from that, a special fellowship was created, and the Harriet and her husband were the first or the second couple who had this special fellowship, and it was in 2001, 2002, and 2003. So they were in Bellagio for 3 consecutive years, and they welcomed the guests there, and she'll tell you all about that, as well as the details of her relationship with Bellagio. I'd also say that I had the privilege of being at Bellagio for 6 weeks in about 1991, I think it was, and it was an incredible experience. And I think we're really lucky to have Harriet tell us about Bellagio and to share the information. And I have to say, the Rockefeller Foundation does a fantastic service in providing this wonderful place, both for conferences and for scholars to go and spend time there. Anyway, I look forward to hearing the presentation, and I know that you'll have a wonderful afternoon hearing her talk now. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to be here. And thank you, Michael, in absentia. A few months ago, I had tea with Prue and Michael Thorner, and we discovered we had all been at Bellagio at different times. And Michael asked whether I would give a talk about the Bellagio Center. That's how this came about. Bellagio means different things to different people. If you're a traveler, you may have visited this picturesque Italian village on the shores of Lake Como. If you're a gambler, I guess you think of Las Vegas. But to a select group of academics, artists, and world leaders, Bellagio means just one thing. The Bellagio Center, a study and conference center in northern Italy owned by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Bellagio Center is situated on a promontory in the foothills of the Alps, where Lake Como separates into two branches, Como on the west and Lecco on the east. This point is called Il Punto Spartivento in Italian. It means the point that divides the winds. It's kind of poetic sounding. So right at this little point on the peninsula is where the village of Bellagio is situated, and on the hillside above it is the Bellagio Center. This is the Villa Cervelloni. It's the heart of the Bellagio Center. The villa and 7 other buildings, parts of them dating back to the 16th and 17th century, are surrounded by 50 acres of parks, gardens, and woods, and provide a wonderful atmosphere for writing and for collaboration. For more than 110 years, the Rockefeller Foundation has been bringing professionals from around the world together to try to solve the most challenging problems. Since 1959, when the foundation acquired the center, it has served as a gathering place for these policymakers to turn ideas into solutions that can really change the world. For example, Bellagio has held conferences that have brought about modern systems of international finance. It has been the staging ground for an agricultural revolution that has saved 1 billion lives in Latin America and Asia. It was the setting for agreements that led to the HIV/AIDS vaccine and to better vaccines and drugs for other deadly diseases. The Bellagio Center offers a unique, stimulating environment for people to be free from everyday demands, to think, to write, and to have purposeful discussions. This opportunity is provided through 2 programs: conferences, which they call convenings, and the residency program. The center hosts about 1,000 people every year, at as many as 60 convenings and about 120 month-long residencies. The Villa Cervelloni is the headquarters of the residency program, while this building, the Frati, or Friary, is one of 2 facilities devoted to conferences. It has rooms with private baths and meeting rooms to accommodate large groups. The residency program for individual scholars is what Bellagio is most famous for. Rather than a retreat for private reflection like Yaddo or the MacDowell colony, the Bellagio Center Residency offers an opportunity to advance a specific breakthrough project in a stimulating environment where the members forge cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural connections with other residents, specialists in their fields with a project such as a social science study, a book, a scientific paper, an art installation, or a musical composition, spend a month at the study center. Each resident with a spouse or partner, if they accompany them, is provided with a comfortable private room, bath, and studio. Many of the residents are housed in the main villa, while others live in a nearby building. Everyone has free meals a day at the villa, with the option to take a bag lunch back to your studio or have a picnic on the grounds. Many of the rooms have an attached studio, but some residents are assigned remote studios, such as this one. It's called La Veduta, which means vista or view. This is another remote studio. This one's called the Chapel Studio. It's quite ancient, as you can see. These unattached studios have heating, electricity, phone, and internet connection. One studio out in the woods is reserved for composers or musicians, so they won't disturb the other residents. Most residents bring their own laptops, but the center will supply computers if necessary, as well as printers, paper, and office supplies. Interaction among the residents is encouraged, and it's probably, I would say, the most valuable part of the Bellagio experience. Residents stay connected to one another and the Rockefeller Foundation long after their residencies end. They always remain members of the Bellagio network. You can see this very cheerful-looking group. They're standing in front of a wonderful old tapestry in the reading room. Here's another group. Lifelong friendships and collaborations are formed. I have a number of friends whom I met at Bellagio, including some authors, writers who have given book talks here at Newbridge. For example, Larry Tye, who's coming in December to talk about his latest book on jazz. Larry is a best-selling author, and some of you, I think, probably remember him from past talks. The residents are expected to give presentations about their projects to the assembled members. This woman is Dara Keeson. She's an artist and a professor of studio art from Rice University, and she's giving her presentation. I should say she was an artist and a professor of studio art. These sketches were all ideas for oil paintings she planned to produce after she finished her residency for an upcoming exhibit. It opened in Houston at Rice, and it traveled to New York, and I was lucky enough to see it. Sadly, Dara was diagnosed with Parkinson's shortly after this photograph was taken. She was very young, mid-50s, and she lived for 19 years, was active for a number of years. After she retired, she remained involved in artists who are compromised in some way. And she was the most life spirit, I think I would call her. Beautiful woman. She reminded me of that saying, if life gives you lemon, make lemonade. This is the main entrance to the Villa Cervelloni, where residents are welcome when they arrive. If you're coming from the States, you take an overnight flight, you reach Milan in the wee hours, and you probably don't get to the villa until around 6 a.m. I was very fortunate to spend 4 different times at Bellagio. Ordinarily, an individual may apply for a second residency after 5 years have passed. Used to be longer, but more recently they changed the interval. One individual is eligible only twice in a lifetime. But we spent 4 times there, and this is what happened. My late husband, Sheldon Segal, whom everyone called Shelley, had a residency there in 1999. During that month, the director, a woman named Gianna Shelley, enlisted Shelley's help on several occasions. She was a wonderful administrator, but she really did not enjoy the social aspects, things like greeting conferences and having dinner with the residents every night and attending all their presentations. So on occasion, she would ask Shelley to step in for her if she had to go to Milan or somewhere else. And I would join him, of course. And out of this came the idea of inviting, excuse me, when I get this, of inviting a couple to host the other residents. As Michael told you, the foundation established the Ella Holbrook Walker Distinguished Fellowship to fill this role. And I'll explain the name a little later. The first couple to be Ella Walker Fellows were Derek and Cicely Bach. You probably know that Derek was the former and future president of Harvard, and his wife Cicely was a well-known writer. The next year, 2001, Shelley and I were invited to be Walker Fellows. We spent some of the most enjoyable and productive months there. We'd arrive in late January and stay until the end of April or May, and we did that for 3 years in a row. During that time, Shelley wrote 3 books, and I finished 1 novel and did the research and finished the first draft for another. This is a gallery on the ground floor as you enter the villa. The entrance is here on the right, and all along here are the public rooms. There are 3 different dining rooms, 1 big banquet room, and there's a reading room and then some salons, like living rooms. There were fresh flowers everywhere from the garden. Beautiful, beautiful bouquets that were changed every day. As one former resident, a famous composer, wrote, Bellagio is the single most beautiful place I have ever been to, but the beauty is only one part of its magic. That's so true. It's the most conducive place for creative writing imaginable. Every need or support is provided. You feel like you're sort of cut off from the world and all its cares, yet you're surrounded by the most interesting and dynamic people. A number of famous people attended meetings at Bellagio while we were there. This is Betty Friedan with a companion. She, as you know, was kind of the founder of the feminist movement, wrote The Feminine Mystique. She was the honored guest at a conference on women. And I had breakfast with her one morning. And she was really a very funny woman. She had sort of an acid wit. She was about 80 at the time, and she was having memory issues. But she was still an icon to the women who were there for the conference. It's the tradition to give a copy of your book or project to the Bellagio Library. Here we are presenting our latest books. I think this was during our 2nd fellowship. Aside from writing, we greeted visiting conference members, handled any problems that came up with the residents, socialized with the residents and conference attendees in the evenings. This was aperitif hour, which occurred every evening before dinner. That's my husband talking to a couple from Florida State University. There was aperitif before dinner, wine with dinner, and here we are after dinner in the main salon for what we called grappa time. They served grappa, sambuco, limoncello, and plain old brandy. But mainly it was a time for mingling and getting to know one another. If someone played the piano or another instrument, we would gather round and sing. Sometimes we'd play records and dance. Most of us would go back to our studios to work at night for a few hours, but some of the younger residents went down to the village to check out the bars and Bellagio nightlife, such as it was. It's really a very sleepy little town. Our most important role was to be there for the residents, for whatever help they needed. There were times when emotional support was welcome. One task we took upon ourselves was to arrange excursions, which for the whole group, actually. This usually entailed hiring a boat and going to a point of interest or a good restaurant in one of the other towns around the lake. Here I am taking a group of women to a silk factory outlet in the city of Como. We were there to buy designer scarves. This became a favorite activity. All the famous Italian and French designers had their silk scarves and men's ties manufactured in the Como area. Ferragamo, Gucci, Versace, Karl Lagerfeld, and Yves Saint Laurent. They all were represented there, and their scarves were for sale at ridiculously low prices. Shopping was really fun in Bellagio, and it was good exercise. As you can see, the streets from the village were really staircases. This is the main drag. It's called Salita Cervelloni. Salita means alley or lane. And you can see it's quite a climb. Women who had lived there all their lives had very well-developed leg muscles. This is a view from across Lake Como of the Bellagio waterfront, and then above it, the study center. On the right is the Villa Cervelloni, and this little building on the left, which is partly obscured by trees, is called the Villetta. That's where Shelley and I lived for the 3 fellowships when we were there. It was charming inside. It had a sitting area, 2 studios, one for each of us, a kitchenette that they kept stocked with snacks. Upstairs, there was a bedroom, my studio. There were 2 bathrooms and a laundry with the washer and dryer. My studio was on the 2nd floor, and it looked out on the lake and down over the rooftops to the church piazza. When I first got there, I was looking out. My desk was in front of the window, and after 2 days, I moved it across the room against the wall because I found I was gazing at the waterfront and the ferry going back and forth instead of writing. This is the car ferry, or the traghetto, which I could watch from my window. Lake Como is only 29 miles long, so we would often drive around the lake or cross over on the ferry to the other side. We had a 4-seater Fiat that was available to us, and we would go to beautiful old villas that were open to the public and magnificent gardens, and then up into the mountains to villages. You can see them. They're hidden away where there might be a little restaurant with a few tables. They all made their own pasta and bread, and I don't think I ever had a bad meal at one of those restaurants. The lake is probably too polluted for swimming and also too cold, but back in the early 1960s, not long after it opened, my husband was holding a meeting of an international group at the center. Two of the members were from Sweden and Finland, tall, good-looking young men. One was Olof, and the other was Tapani. Well, early one morning, they were taking a walk along the lake, and the water looked so inviting, they simply removed their clothes and dived in. The director at the time was a couple, an American couple, and he was kind of formal. He took his responsibilities very seriously, and truthfully, he was stuffy. And I heard that the staff referred to him behind his back as Il Gran Signor. So later that day, Shelley received a note from Il Gran Signor in his mailbox. Dr. Segal, kindly inform your Scandinavian colleagues that nude bathing has not yet reached this far south on the continent. For a small town, Bellagio's population then and now is about 3,500. The cathedral, as they call it, is quite elaborate. Notice the beautiful altar. It's all gold leaf. And the ceiling, the frescoes on the ceiling, there are statuary around all the columns, and this fragment, relic from a ruin, it's a bas-relief. You don't see it, but often the alcoves on either side, there are votive candles, dozens of them, and the flickering candlelight and the atmosphere inside, it's really spectacular. It's a small church. I mean, the floor space is small, but it has soaring ceilings and a very tall bell tower. Here are some of my favorite spots at the Bellagio Center itself. This is the library, my favorite room. The shelves are filled with publications of former residents. Notice the ceiling. If you can just see, there are carved rosettes, and they're painted in pastels, and it's carved along the beams. I love the way there are two of these very modern, iconic Eames chairs and ottomans. I used to love to go and recline in one of those and read in the morning when it was really empty, everyone at work in their studios. Giannicelli, the director, loved combining modern furnishings and fixtures with antique pieces. This is the view from the Lake Lecco side of the villa, the back of the villa, actually. All of this territory that right around here is part of the Bellagio Center property. That building, that pink building, and this one, this is the Sfondrata, named for the bishop who built it, I think in the 17th century. This is the frati, the friary that I showed you earlier. Those two buildings are reserved for conferences. This building just below the villa was called the Milanese, and that's where some of the residents lived. You had to be young and fit to live there because it was a very steep climb up to the villa for meals. In the distance, you can see this village. It's called Pescalo. It's a very quaint fishing village, and it's really only accessible by foot. You can't see it, but there's an ancient wall at the edge of the center, and you can go through a doorway there and walk down to the village. If you're driving, you have to park up here at the top and walk down these narrow, winding cobblestone lanes. So if you have a rolling suitcase, that would be a problem. The village is virtually unchanged from maybe 100 years ago because there's nothing really there. There's a former convent that's the only restaurant in town, and there are rooms and apartments for rent. But it has retained its quaint atmosphere. Some of these buildings are now, the old homes are owned by people from Milan who spend weekends and vacations there. And this small harbor is filled with pleasure boats. This photograph was taken about 25 years ago, so it doesn't show the sailboats, motorboats that are there now. The beautifully maintained grounds of the center are constantly groomed by a crew of gardeners, typically Italianate the shape of the evergreens, and they're always raking and clipping and cultivating. Here's a statue of a faun playing the flute in the gardens, and notice there's a lion skin draped around his shoulders. There are a number of ancient statues on the grounds. There's one of Pliny the Younger, and you can walk through the woods and come upon shrines and busts of old counts who lived there. This is a point of interest. It's the George Clooney Villa Oleandra, which is located in Lallio, not far from Bellagio. You can see the villas right on the waterfront. Here's a bird's eye view. Clooney bought the adjacent properties to preserve their privacy. When the family is in residence, this whole waterfront is lined up with small boats with paparazzi and their long-range lenses, trying to get pictures of the Clooney twins, the children. And it's a real invasion of privacy. There are rumors that George Clooney is putting the property on the market because of that. May be on the market for all I know, if you're interested. An ongoing project that was the idea of the director Giannicelli was to restore and repurpose some of the ancient buildings that were in disuse. It was so imaginative. If you remember the pink building for conferences, the Friary, this is what it looked like before restoration. They had iron bars that propped it up, and it was off limits because of the danger of collapse. This is what it looked like right after restoration, before the final coat of deep pink paint was applied. You can see on the second story, the arches were filled in with stucco, and on the ground floor, they put in window glass and doorways. The Italian government has very strict regulations for historical buildings. Everything must be approved by the Ministry of Cultural Heritage. The footprint has to remain the same, and the exterior may be restored and certain improvements made, like window glass being installed, but basically it has to look pretty much the same, keep the same outline. The interior was preserved as much as possible. This is a second story. You see the stone floor, which was all broken up, was restored, and the wooden beam ceiling. On the left, all along this corridor, there were cells for the friars where they lived. That was gutted, and very attractive bedrooms with private baths were built for conference members. Beneath the frati, in an underground crypt, are the graves of the friars from many centuries ago. They have been left undisturbed. This was filled with junk, debris, which was cleaned out, but they respected the graves, of course. Here's a close-up of one of the graves. You can see the skull and crossbones and the crucifix. You get an eerie feeling when you go down there. It's not quite like the catacombs in Rome or Paris with exposed bones or skeletons, but definitely there's a mood. The Bellagio Center has a fascinating history. We used to hike up to the peak of the promontory where there are ruins dating back to the 6th century BCE. Over the centuries, this castle was attacked and rebuilt again and again, and finally destroyed in the 14th century. There were pirates on Lake Como, and there were wars among the various Italian states before the country was unified. The region of Lombardy, of which Como is part, was conquered by the Romans, the Franks, the Normans, and Germanic people. Pliny the Younger is supposed to have built his Villa Tragedy here on the cliff. He built 2 villas, comedy and tragedy. That would have been in the 1st century of the Common Era. Well, Pliny notwithstanding, we owe the existence of the Bellagio Center to this beautiful woman for whom our fellowships were named. Helena, or Ella Holbrook Walker, Princess della Torre e Tasso. This painting, this portrait, hangs in a prominent spot in the Villa Cervelloni, in the Princess Room. She was born in 1875 in Michigan, not far from Detroit. Ella was the Hiram Walker liquor heiress. And remember, this was the Downton Abbey era, where American heiresses married impoverished, titled Europeans. Ella married 3 times. In 1897, at the age of 22, she married an Austro-Hungarian nobleman, Count Manfred von Matuszka. Here he is. Notice his luxuriant mustache. They were married for 29 years. It wasn't a very happy union, evidently. First of all, World War I occurred then, and the U.S. government took away Ella's American citizenship and put her money in escrow. So she was living in reduced circumstances in Berlin and Vienna. Her parents were very worried about her. She was cut off from them. The war ended, and she stayed with her husband for quite a few years. But in 1926, Ella Walker, then known as the Countess Matrushka, divorced Manfred. He promptly married his mistress. Ella's second marriage to this dandy-looking fellow, James Hazen Hyde. He was an American capitalist. It lasted all of 2 years. She divorced him, and finally, in 1932, Ella married this handsome fellow, Prince Alexander Karl Egon Theopold Lamoral Johann Baptist Maria, Duke of Duino, and Prince of the German House of Turn und Taxis, or Torre e Tasso in Italian. His dynasty dates back to the days when all of Lombardy was under control of the Holy Roman Empire. Ella's money helped seal the deal, but it may have been a love match as well, because the prince already had a wife and 3 children. As a Catholic, he couldn't divorce, so he secured an annulment from the Vatican, installed his wife and the kids in a castle in Switzerland, and married Ella. Thus, Ella Walker became Her Serene Highness, the Principessa della Torre e Tasso. After all that, they didn't spend much time together. The prince was refurbishing his official seat, the Castle Duino near Trieste, while Ella was attending to the estate she had recently bought in Bellagio, the Villa Cervelloni. It was quite run down, but with her millions, she set about refurbishing it and the villa and the grounds, and this became her life's work. Sadly, the prince died 5 years after the wedding, so Ella was now a widow as well as a princess. She never had children of her own, but she adopted Huberta, the adopted daughter of her first husband. Huberta was actually his niece or maybe his cousin. It could have been both, considering the way they intermarried. Ella was evidently a very forgiving, tolerant woman, and she was much beloved by her first husband's family. Well, after all, they were her family for 29 years, and she was very fond of them. It was said that she had a big heart and was a very sophisticated, worldly woman with the marvelous blue eyes and a radiant smile. As in every fairy tale, dark days lay ahead. In the 1930s, Mussolini and his fascist party took power. Ella's status didn't change until the U.S. entered the war. As an American citizen, her citizenship had been restored, along with her money. But she was now the enemy. But with the terrible roads at the time and the slow automobiles, she was relatively safe in Bellagio because it was remote, and she was protected by her Italian friends. However, in September 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies, and the Nazis moved in. They took over the north of Italy and Rome. The princess was given 24 hours to vacate the villa. She crossed the lake at night and took refuge in the home of friends. Warned that she was going to be arrested, she, at the age of 69, she was led by smugglers, and she escaped over the Alps to Switzerland. This photo of Mount Bisbino shows one of the most common routes for escaping over the border to Switzerland during World War II. There wasn't really a road. Couldn't go by car or even horseback. So Ella walked over those mountains. Incidentally, this city is Cernobbio, the northernmost city in Italy, and it's famous for these buildings down here. The Hotel Villa d'Este, where movie stars like Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton always loved to stay. Mussolini and his mistress, Claretta Petacci, were captured on the 27th of April of 1945 by local partisans, not far from Bellagio, near the village of Dongo on Lake Como. I remember taking a boat ride to the north of the lake, and the captain pointed out Dongo, and he said with great pride, "That's where Il Duce was held prisoner before they murdered him." And I realized this guy was, probably in the army during World War II, and Mussolini was his leader. After the war, Ella returned to Bellagio. The Nazis had used the Villa Serbelloni as an officer's retreat and a rehab center for wounded soldiers. They left the villa in terrible condition. They ransacked it. They stole furniture and destroyed artwork. Ella embarked on her second restoration project of the villa and the gardens. She was planning her estate, and her main heir was her adopted daughter. She left a grant to her father's alma mater, the University of Michigan, but she wanted the property in Bellagio to be used for a good purpose. Dean Rusk was president of the foundation in 1959. Ella was then 84 years old. This was just before Rusk was Secretary of State under Kennedy and Johnson. He and his wife visited Italy to determine whether Ella Walker's property would be of any use to the foundation's mission, which was to promote the well-being of humanity around the world, unquote. After a cordial meeting with the princess, Rusk signed an agreement. That's his actual signature. Ella Walker would continue to live there for the rest of her life, and upon her death, the Rockefeller Foundation would inherit the villa and its 50 acres of parks and gardens. For maintenance of the property, the princess left an endowment of $2 million, which in today's money would be about $21.6 million. This was Princess Ella at the end of her life. She'd sit on one of 2 stone lions that guard the entrance to the villa. Mrs. Rusk had always wanted to sail across the Atlantic, so she and her husband boarded an ocean liner for the voyage home. By the time they docked in New York, Dean Rusk was met by a foundation officer with the shocking news that Ella Walker, the princess, had died in Bellagio, and the Rockefeller Foundation now owned the Villa Cervelloni. Since 1959, when they acquired it, over 4,000 residents have participated in the Bellagio residency program. 100 of them were Nobel laureates. 40 have received the MacArthur Grant, the so-called Genius Award. Some notable alumni include renowned authors Bernard Malamud, Maya Angelou, Susan Sontag, Michael Ondaatje, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was there in 1977 when she was a professor at Columbia Law School, and former President of Ireland, Mary Robbins, was also there. Last year, they welcomed 103 residents from 33 different countries. Among their number was the lovely young inaugural poet, Amanda Gorman, whom, if you remember, read a poem at Joe Biden's inauguration and again at the recent Democratic Convention. In addition to music and art, this year's class includes topics such as climate solutions, reinventing capitalism, health and equity, artificial intelligence, gender, and human rights. It's a very competitive process, but for those who have a relevant project to complete and relish the idea of working in idyllic surroundings with cohorts from all over the world, the Rockefeller Foundation will soon be accepting applications for the year 2026. Good luck, and thank you for listening.